Hi, my name is Dan Oddy with Detroit Speed.
And I'm Mark McDonald, Fabricator here at Detroit Speed. And today we're going to show you how to install the Mustang subframe connectors.
Cut out and position the seat riser template with the seat mounting holes on the car. Trace the cutout section of the template onto the seat riser. Drill out the spot welds along the cutout section of the seat riser, as well as the spot welds holding the support bracket in place on the front side of the seat riser. Cut out the section of the seat riser from the template. Pry back the seat riser section and remove it from the vehicle along with the support bracket. Save these pieces for reinstallation later. Cut out the section of the floor cutout template and position it up against the back of the frame rail as noted on the template. Use a straight edge off the pinch weld flange to center the template. Drill 4 pilot holes in the corners of the rectangular cutout in the template from underneath the vehicle. From inside the vehicle, connect the 4 pilot holes in the floor pan and remove this section from the vehicle. Measure the length of the original frame rails from underneath the vehicle from the transmission crossmember. Compare this measurement to the length of the front frame rail doublers, as you may need to trim some material off the back. Once the length has been verified, tap the front frame rail doublers over the original frame rails using a rubber hammer. Plug weld the holes along both sides of the frame rail doublers to the original frame rails. Also, plug weld the bottom of the floor pan and the back surface of the transmission crossmember. Center and position the frame rail doubler closeout, mark the bottom edge of the closeout, and trim off the extra material so it sits flush against the edge of the frame rail. Grind the end of the frame rail smooth. Place the closeout against the end of the frame rail and plug weld it to the floor pan. Weld along the bottom edge of the closeout. Grind all welds around the frame rail doublers for a smooth finish. Drill out the spot welds that hold the e-brake cable bracket to the frame rail and remove the bracket. We will be installing the DSC Quadrolink into this vehicle, so we will now use that 1/2 inch long hex bolt and 2 1/4 inch long spacer from the torque box kit provided with the rear suspension. Install the spacer onto the bolt and pass the bolt through the inside frame rail. Install the grooved weld spacer onto the bolt and pass the bolt through the factory front leaf spring pocket. Install a 1/2 inch nut and washer on the bolt and tighten. Place the outboard torque box plate over the crush tube and against the inside frame rail so it is level to the frame rail. Tack and plug weld the plate to the frame rail. Then, finish weld around the perimeter of the plate. Remove the 1/2 inch bolt and spacers from the frame rail. Modify the floor pan so the torque box top assembly sits flush against the frame rail and floor pan. Once the top assembly sits tight against the floor pan and frame rail, tack weld it in place. Stitch weld the top assembly to the floor pan. Then, weld it to the outer torque box plate. Finish weld the top assembly to the floor pan. Install the inboard torque box plate onto the 1/2-inch bolt used earlier along with the weld spacer with the groove. Install the bolt through the inside frame rail and tighten with a 1/2-inch nut and washer. The inboard plate should sit square to the top assembly and parallel with the outboard plate. Tack weld the inboard plate to the top assembly, then finish weld on the outside and inside of the inboard plate. Fit the bottom torque box plate into position in between the inboard and outboard plates. The bottom surface should be 3/4 inch below the center of the factory leaf spring bolt hole. The vertical closeout may need to be trimmed to achieve the 3/4 inch dimension. Tack weld in place and then finish weld around the perimeter of the bottom plate. From inside the vehicle, slide the subframe connector down to the seat riser cutout in the floor pan. Outline the subframe connector. Cut out the floor pan only where you trace the subframe connector. Be careful not to cut the torque box directly behind the floor pan sheet metal. Fit the subframe connector back into position. Make sure the connector sits directly on the front of the torque box as well as up against the end of the front frame rail doubler from underneath the vehicle. Once you have a good fit, tack weld the slot at the center of the connector where it is bent. This is left open in case you need to make an adjustment in the angle of the connector for fitment. Remove the connector from the vehicle and fully weld the slot in the connector. Grind the welds in the connector smooth for a clean finish. Position the subframe connector back in place and tack weld the spot at the back of the torque box and then to the front frame rail doubler underneath the vehicle. Fully weld the connector to the floor pan underneath the seat riser from inside the vehicle. Fully weld the front of the subframe connector to the front frame rail doubler from underneath the vehicle. Stitch weld the connector to the floor pan and fully weld the end of the connector to the torque box. From underneath the vehicle, weld the connector to the floor pan where it passes through. Place a section of the seat riser that was removed earlier and lay it back into the vehicle on top of the subframe connector. Mark the section of the seat riser where the subframe connector will need to pass through. Cut out the marked section of the seat riser. Place the section of the seat riser back into the vehicle and trim the slot for the subframe connector as needed. Once you have a good fit, tack weld the seat riser back into the vehicle. Weld the seat riser to the subframe connector where it passes through. Finish weld the seat riser in place and grind the welds for a smooth finish. Repeat this procedure for the opposite side of the vehicle to install the other DSC subframe connector.